The first time I stood barefoot on that island beach, wedding veil brushing against the wind, I almost laughed at how impossible it all seemed. Only months earlier, I was sitting at my kitchen table with cold tea in front of me, replaying the words that had stung the deepest. At your age, dating is embarrassing. People will laugh. Have you ever been told that a dream you carry is too late, too foolish, or too selfish for someone your age? Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe now because this is just the beginning of our journey into family, resilience, and self-discovery, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. What I want to know from you is this. If your family doubted your happiness, would you fight for it anyway, or would you bury it to keep the peace? Share your answer below, because I think many of us have stood at that same crossroad in life. I didn't plan for any of this, and maybe that's why it still feels so unbelievable. Let me take you back to the night where it really began, when everything seemed so ordinary that I almost ignored the turning point completely. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I had just washed my last dish of the evening and sat down with a cup of tea that was already cooling. It was in that silence that my daughter's words replayed in my mind. Mom, you're too old to be thinking about dating. People your age don't fall in love, they settle or they stop. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, the casual dismissal, like I was a child reaching for something silly. I didn't respond at the time, not out loud, but my heart had burned with the sting of it. Later that night, I sat scrolling on my phone, though I wasn't looking for anything in particular. My thumb hovered over an ad for a dating website. I chuckled to myself and put the phone down, shaking my head. What business did I have signing up for something like that? Women my age were supposed to keep busy with gardening clubs, book circles, or maybe babysitting grandchildren. But here's the thing, I wasn't ready to fold myself into the background of my own life. Not yet. I remembered sitting in that kitchen chair and staring at the screen for a long time, the glow lighting up my face in the dark. I didn't click join that night. Instead, I went to bed with a knot in my chest, feeling both ashamed for even thinking about it and restless with the possibility of something more. The days that followed didn't make it easier. At a family dinner, someone joked about older people losing their dignity by chasing romance. Laughter filled the room, but it wasn't the warm kind. I smiled faintly, stabbing my fork into the potatoes, but inside I felt myself shrinking. Still, that voice inside me, the one I tried to silence, kept asking, why not me? Why shouldn't I hope for companionship again? Why should the door to love slam shut just because of a number on a calendar? That same week, I found myself at the library, wandering the aisles without looking for a book. What I really wanted was distraction. Instead, I overheard two women in their 60s chatting by the computers. One laughed nervously as she admitted to trying online dating. The other leaned in and whispered about her sister, who had met her second husband on the same site. I froze. It was as if the universe had pushed their voices directly into my ears. I pretended to examine a biography on the shelf, but really I was hanging on every word. My cheeks flushed when I realized what I was doing, but my pulse had quickened. Maybe it wasn't as ridiculous as I thought. That night, I opened the website again. This time, I created an account. It wasn't glamorous. I spent 2 hours trying to find a profile picture where I didn't look stiff or too formal. Most of my photos were from family gatherings, where I was the one holding the camera. When I finally uploaded one of myself from a trip 2 summers ago, I hesitated before hitting save. Filling out the questions was worse. What did I even say about myself? That I liked crossword puzzles? That I was rediscovering who I was after years of putting everyone else first? I wanted to sound approachable but not desperate. Strong but not cold. It felt like walking a tightrope, balancing how I wanted to be seen with how I was afraid people already saw me. When the profile was finally done, I stared at the blinking cursor in the empty message box. The site suggested icebreaker lines I could send, but every one of them felt awkward. So, I didn't send anything. I just closed the laptop and went to bed, my heart pounding as if I'd done something scandalous. The following morning, I half expected my family to somehow know, to look at me differently, to sense that I had crossed into forbidden territory. But nothing changed. They carried on with their conversations, their errands, their busy lives, and I realized this was my secret. For now, it belonged only to me, and there was power in that. A few days later, the first message arrived. My breath caught when I saw the notification. It was short, polite, and from a man whose photo showed kind eyes behind glasses. I didn't know what to say back, so I stared at the words until they blurred, and then closed the site without replying. It took me another day before I gathered the nerve to respond. My fingers shook as I typed out a simple hello. It wasn't clever or charming, but it was honest, and in that honesty, a small door creaked open. At the time, I couldn't have imagined where that single word would lead. What I can tell you is that on that same evening, as I sat there with my heart racing after pressing send, I thought of my daughter's words again, the voice that told me I was too old. I let them pass through me, but I didn't let them stop me this time. I had taken the first step, and even if it led nowhere, at least it was mine to take. And that was the beginning, the smallest act of rebellion wrapped inside a simple hello. When I look back, it surprises me how much weight a few typed sentences can carry. The first days of exchanging messages felt like testing the strength of thin ice, every word placed carefully, every pause filled with second-guessing. The man with kind eyes introduced himself simply. He didn't write long speeches or try to impress. His messages were brief, direct, and almost cautious, like he wasn't sure if I would reply at all. That made me feel oddly safe. There was no rush, no pressure, only a quiet invitation to keep talking. At first, I kept my responses just as short. I told him about the books I liked, the way I enjoyed walking in the park near my house, and how I had recently started cooking more meals for myself instead of always eating what was quick. He asked gentle questions, never probing too far, and each time I replied, it felt like I was drawing a thin line out into the dark, waiting to see if it would be pulled back. It was around the fourth exchange that something shifted. He mentioned that he had lost his wife years ago, and the way he wrote it was not dramatic but honest, like a fact that carried its own quiet weight. I sat there staring at those words, unsure how to respond. My instinct was to retreat, to keep the conversation light. But instead, I typed that I understood what it was like to lose someone who shaped your life. My hands trembled when I hit send. That moment cracked something open between us. After that, our conversations became longer. We began to share not just the easy details but the harder truths, the loneliness, the doubts about starting over, the way people around us sometimes made us feel invisible. One night, after an hour of back and forth messages, I realized I was smiling at my screen. It wasn't about the words themselves, but about the way he seemed to really see me. Not as someone's mother, not as a background character in a family gathering, but as a person in her own right. That realization startled me. I had almost forgotten what it felt like. Still, there was hesitation. Each time his name appeared in my inbox, a part of me wanted to push it away. What if this was foolish? What if I was being naive? I remembered all the jokes I had overheard about old people, chasing love online, and shame would wash over me in waves. But then I'd open his message and find something thoughtful, something that made me laugh, and the shame would loosen its grip just enough for me to answer again. As the weeks passed, our conversations shifted from the website to longer emails and eventually to phone calls. The first time his voice filled the line, I almost hung up before he could say more than hello. But then I heard the steadiness in his tone, the way he wasn't rushing me, and my nerves began to settle. We spoke about ordinary things, the weather, the books on our nightstands, the meals we had cooked that week. But underneath those simple exchanges, something steady was building. I noticed how he listened, how he remembered the small details I mentioned in passing. When I told him about how my hands ached after a day of gardening, he asked the next day if they were better. When I admitted I had trouble sleeping sometimes, he said he often left the radio on low at night for the same reason. There was a quiet recognition between us, as if we had both been carrying similar shadows without knowing it. I'll never forget one call in particular. He asked me what my happiest memory was. At first I laughed and said it was too hard to choose, but he waited, not filling the silence, just giving me space. And in that pause, a memory rose to the surface, sitting on the beach years ago, before everything in my life had shifted, watching my children build castles in the sand while my husband leaned back in a chair beside me. I told him that story, and my voice wavered as I spoke. There was a long pause on his end before he said softly, "I miss the sound of waves too." That simple response sent a shiver through me. Not because it was poetic, but because it was real. It told me he understood without needing to explain. Our conversations began to spill into every part of my day. I'd check my phone in the morning, wondering if he had written. I found myself cooking with more care, even when it was only for me, because I wanted to tell him about it later. I walked longer in the park, noticing small details, the shape of a tree, the way the air cooled at sunset so I could share them with him. And yet, I kept all of this hidden from my family. When my daughter called, I pretended nothing was different. I asked about her work, her children, the endless small dramas of her world, and never mentioned the man whose voice had become a steady rhythm in my own life. I told myself I was protecting the fragile newness of it, guarding it from judgment before it was strong enough to stand on its own. Still, there were nights I lay awake wondering if I was making a mistake. Could I trust this? Could I trust him? Could I even trust myself to know the difference anymore? It was during one of those restless nights that he surprised me. Instead of our usual call, he sent a message that simply read, "One day, when you're ready, I'd like to meet you by the ocean, somewhere quiet. Just you and me." I stared at those words for a long time, my heart thudding in my chest. A part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to leap into whatever this was becoming. Another part held back, afraid of how real it would make everything. I didn't answer right away, but the thought of that invitation stayed with me, pulsing in the back of my mind. I could almost hear the waves he spoke of, see the stretch of horizon where sea met sky. I didn't know it then, but that single suggestion would grow into the plan that led us to the island, the moment that still plays in my memory as both terrifying and beautiful. For now, though, I simply wrote back, "Maybe someday." And in his reply, just 2 words, "I'll wait." I felt the beginning of something I hadn't dared believe in for years. There comes a time when conversations are no longer enough, when voices over the phone and words on a screen feel like shadows of something fuller. That moment crept up on me slowly, until one evening I realized I couldn't keep pretending our connection lived only in messages. He had been patient, never pushing, never asking for more than I was willing to give. But the idea of meeting in person had been hanging between us since the night he mentioned the ocean. I had tucked it away, telling myself it was too soon, too risky, maybe even foolish. Yet every day we spoke, that hesitation loosened, replaced by a quiet pull I couldn't ignore. I began imagining the details. What it would feel like to see him walking toward me. How his face would change when he realized I wasn't just a voice anymore. I even wondered if his hands would tremble when he reached for mine, the way mine already did when I thought about him. These thoughts startled me. I hadn't let myself picture something so vivid in years. The turning point came on a day that should have been ordinary. We were on the phone, talking about nothing in particular, when he paused. There was a long silence before he said, almost carefully, "You know, we could meet somewhere quiet, no pressure, just a simple meeting." My heart hammered in my chest. I wanted to say yes right away, but I hesitated. The weight of my family's voices pressed against me, all their warnings and doubts. I could already hear the questions they would ask, the judgment in their tone. But then I heard his voice again, steady, waiting, not demanding, not impatient, just open. That was the moment I said, almost in a whisper, "Maybe we should." We chose carefully. Not a crowded city or a noisy restaurant, but an island not too far, a place where the sea could wrap around us and soften the edges of everything uncertain. It felt both daring and quiet at the same time, like stepping into a new life but keeping it just between us. In the weeks leading up to it, I felt 2 versions of myself battling inside me. One was the cautious woman who had spent years playing it safe, who told her family everything they wanted to hear, who avoided conflict at any cost. The other was someone I barely recognized, someone who checked the weather forecast for the island each morning, who folded and refolded clothes into a suitcase, who smiled at her reflection in the mirror as if she were meeting herself again. I didn't tell my family. I couldn't. Whenever I pictured their faces, I felt my courage shrink. They had always believed they knew what was best for me, and maybe for a long time I had believed it too. But now, I wanted something that didn't belong to them, something that was mine alone. The night before I left, I lay awake listening to the tick of the clock. Doubts crowded my mind. What if he wasn't what I thought? What if the connection dissolved the moment we were face to face? I almost reached for my phone to cancel, to retreat into the safety of distance. But then I remembered his voice, the way he had said he would wait, the patience threaded through every word he had ever spoken to me. That steadiness was what finally carried me into the morning. When I arrived at the ferry, I felt like a teenager again, nervous and exhilarated all at once. I kept my scarf pulled tight around my neck, as though hiding my face could protect me from the enormity of what I was doing. The ride across the water was a blur of shifting waves and restless thoughts. And then, there he was, standing near the edge of the pier, his hands in his pockets, watching the horizon as if he had been waiting his whole life. My breath caught. For a moment I stayed frozen, afraid to move, afraid the image would dissolve if I blinked. But then he turned, and his eyes found mine. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't run toward me or sweep me into an embrace. He just smiled, a slow, quiet smile that reached all the way to his eyes. That was enough. My legs carried me forward before I had time to think, and when I stood in front of him, he simply said, "You came." Those two words unraveled something tight in my chest. I nodded, unable to speak, and then he reached out, not rushing, not grabbing, but simply offering his hand. When I placed mine in his, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The rest of that first day is etched in my memory like a series of photographs. We walked along the shoreline, our shoes sinking into the sand. We ate a simple meal at a small cafe where the owner greeted us as if we had been coming there for years. We sat on a bench facing the sea, talking in the same easy rhythm we had built over months, only now with the comfort of shared silence in between. I kept waiting for the awkwardness to appear, for the moment when the illusion would break, but it never did. If anything, being with him in person felt even more natural than I had dared to hope. That night, as I lay in the small room I had rented, I thought about the secret I was carrying. My family didn't know where I was, who I was with, what this meant. Part of me felt guilty, like I was betraying them. But another part whispered that maybe, for once, it was all right to choose something for myself. The days on the island blurred into a rhythm of long walks, quiet meals, and unhurried conversations. We didn't speak about the future, not directly. We didn't make promises we couldn't keep. But in the way he held my hand when we crossed the street, in the way he poured me coffee in the morning, I felt something more than words. When the time came to leave, I stood on the pier again, suitcase at my side, and looked at him. There were so many things I wanted to say, but all I managed was, "I don't want this to end." He nodded slowly. "It doesn't have to." That was when I realized this wasn't just a fleeting escape. It was the beginning of something that would demand choices, courage, and honesty things I wasn't sure I was ready to face with my family. But as the ferry pulled away, and I saw him standing there with his hand raised in a quiet wave, I knew I couldn't go back to the life I had before. Something had shifted, and whether my family understood it or not, I was no longer the woman who had quietly accepted their version of my life. I was someone who had found her own voice, and someone who was willing, at last, to use it. When I returned home from the island, it was as if I had stepped into two different worlds at once. On the outside, everything looked the same. My family asked the usual questions: how was the trip? Was the weather nice? Did I eat well? I answered carefully, choosing words that sounded ordinary. But inside me, nothing was ordinary anymore. I carried a quiet brightness with me, a secret warmth that made even the most routine tasks feel lighter. I found myself smiling while folding laundry, humming while stirring a pot on the stove, catching my reflection in the mirror and noticing a spark I hadn't seen in years. I thought I could keep this new part of my life tucked safely away, invisible to anyone else. But family has a way of noticing even the smallest changes, and it didn't take long before questions grew sharper. It started with my daughter. One evening, she came over unannounced, settling into the kitchen like she always did. As we talked, she studied me with a look I knew too well. Finally, she set down her cup and asked, "What's going on with you? You seem different." I laughed it off, brushing it away with a shrug. "Different how?" I asked, pretending to be busy with the dishes. "You're glowing," she said flatly, narrowing her eyes. "Don't try to tell me it's just the vitamins you've been taking." Her words made my heart pound. I wanted to tell her everything, but fear stopped me. I couldn't bear the thought of her disapproval, the arguments, the judgment, so I smiled and changed the subject. But from that moment on, I knew I was being watched more closely. The secrecy grew heavier with time. I became careful about my phone, leaving it face down on the counter, locking it when I never used to bother. I made excuses for little absences, blamed errands for missed calls, and invented harmless details to cover the truth. Each lie felt like a stone in my pocket, weighing me down, yet I kept carrying them. The more I tried to keep it hidden, the more tangled it became. My sister called one afternoon and asked why my number kept showing up in places she didn't recognize. I froze, realizing she must have glanced at our shared family account. I muttered something about a friend from a community group, hoping it sounded convincing, but I could tell she didn't fully believe me. At night, I lay awake with conflicting voices in my head. One part of me whispered that I deserved happiness, that it wasn't wrong to choose something for myself after years of putting everyone else first. Another part scolded me, asking what would happen if the truth came out, if I risked losing the trust of the people I loved most. The push and pull exhausted me, but I couldn't let go of what I had found. He noticed the strain, too. During one of our late calls, he asked gently, "Is this getting too hard for you?" I wanted to say yes, to admit the weight was crushing me. But the thought of giving him up felt unbearable. So I told him I was fine, even though we both knew I wasn't. The tension finally reached a breaking point one Sunday afternoon. I had been sitting with my family in the living room when my phone lit up on the table. His name didn't appear. It was just a number, but the way I snatched it up too quickly, too nervously, caught my son's attention. He raised an eyebrow, glancing at me with suspicion. "Who keeps calling you like that?" he asked, his tone sharper than usual. "No one," I said quickly, my voice too defensive. "Just a friend." But the damage was done. The room grew quiet, heavy with unspoken questions. My daughter exchanged a look with him, and I felt their eyes pressing against me, searching for answers I wasn't ready to give. That night, I sat at the edge of my bed, my phone clutched in my hand. The walls of my secret were closing in, and I knew I couldn't keep dodging forever. If I wanted this relationship to be real, if I wanted it to last, I would have to stop hiding. The thought terrified me. I imagined the arguments, the raised voices, the disappointment in their eyes. I imagined being accused of selfishness, of recklessness, of making a fool of myself. Yet I also imagined the alternative, losing him because I was too afraid to speak the truth. The choice was clearer than I wanted to admit. For once, I would have to step out of the role I had been given, the safe, predictable woman who never stirred conflict. I would have to show them the version of me they didn't know existed. I didn't sleep much that night. I rehearsed conversations in my head, stumbled over possible explanations, tried to picture how they might react. By morning, I was trembling from the weight of it all, but also strangely steady. I knew one thing for certain. The secret couldn't stay hidden forever. And if my family was going to see me differently, then it was time to let them. The decision to tell the truth wasn't a single bold moment. It was more like standing at the edge of a pool, circling, hesitating, then finally stepping into the water because I knew I couldn't linger forever. The weight of secrecy had reached a point where it was heavier than the fear of their reaction. I had to do it, even if the words came out clumsy, even if no one was ready to hear them. I chose a quiet evening. My children had gathered for dinner. Nothing fancy, just the usual Sunday meal where everyone brought something and filled the house with overlapping voices. I remember setting down the serving spoon, my hands trembling just slightly, and realizing I couldn't keep postponing. If I didn't speak that night, I might never have the courage again. The moment arrived unexpectedly. My son had been teasing his sister about her new haircut, laughter bouncing across the table, when he suddenly turned to me and said, "So, Mom, are you going to explain the mystery calls or should we keep guessing?" His voice was playful, but the question hit me like a stone. My daughter leaned in, waiting, and the laughter faded into silence. I felt my throat tighten. For a second, I wanted to escape, change the subject, make up another excuse, do anything but face their eyes. But something inside me steadied, a voice reminding me that I had carried this secret long enough. "There is something I need to tell you," I said slowly. My fork clinked against the plate as I set it down. "But I need you to listen before you jump to conclusions." The room shifted. Chairs creaked as they sat straighter. The air seemed to press in, and I could feel the pulse in my neck. My words tumbled out unevenly at first, as though I had to push them past years of silence. I told them I had met someone. I told them it happened when I traveled, that it wasn't planned, that it surprised me as much as it might surprise them. The reaction came fast. My daughter blinked hard, her mouth tightening, while my son leaned back with a sharp exhale, as if he'd been holding his breath too long. "You're seeing someone?" my daughter asked, her voice almost breaking. "Yes," I said, my voice firmer this time. "I am." The questions followed in rapid fire. Who was he? How did we meet? Why hadn't I said anything earlier? I answered carefully, truth layered with restraint. I didn't share every detail, but I gave enough for them to know this wasn't a passing distraction. My son's voice carried the first edge of anger. "So, all those excuses, all those times you brushed us off, that was him?" I swallowed hard. "Yes, but it doesn't mean I've cared any less about you." My daughter shook her head, disbelief etched across her face. "You've been lying to us, Mom. Do you realize how that feels?" Her words cut deep. I wanted to defend myself, to remind them that I was more than just their mother, that I was still a woman with my own heart. But I also knew they were right. I had lied, even if it was to protect myself. Silence fell heavy. The meal sat untouched, plates cooling, while emotions shifted around the table like storm clouds. Finally, I spoke again. "I know this is hard for you to understand, but this man, he makes me feel alive again. I didn't expect it. I didn't go looking for it. It happened, and I don't want to pretend it didn't." My son muttered something under his breath, rubbing his forehead with his hand. My daughter's eyes brimmed, though she tried to keep her face steady. I sat there, bracing for rejection, for harsh words that might undo the fragile courage I had gathered. But instead, there was only quiet. A long, uneasy quiet. When my daughter finally spoke, her voice was softer. "I don't know how to feel about this. It's just strange. You've always been the one we leaned on, the steady one. Now it feels like we don't even know you." Her words stung because they were true. They had seen me in one role all their lives, and stepping out of it felt like breaking a contract we'd never spoken aloud. But wasn't that the problem? I had lived so long as someone predictable that they couldn't imagine me any other way. I reached across the table, placing my hand near hers, though she didn't take it. "You don't have to understand everything right now, but please try to see me as more than just the person who raised you. I'm still me. I'm still your mother, but I'm also someone who deserves happiness." The night ended without resolution. They didn't yell, but they didn't embrace the truth either. They left quietly, promising we'd talk more later. The house felt emptier after they walked out, and I sat alone, wondering if I had just widened the gap between us forever. Later, when I told him what happened, he listened without interrupting, then said, "It's a start. They know now. That's better than hiding." I wanted to believe him, but as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the doubts returned. Had I done the right thing? Would my children ever accept this part of me, or had I risked too much? One thing was clear: the secret was no longer mine alone, and once truth has slipped into the open, it can't be pushed back inside. The days that followed were uneasy, like walking through a house where the walls carried unspoken arguments. My phone buzzed less than usual, and when it did, the messages were short, practical, stripped of warmth. They weren't ready to forgive, and maybe I hadn't expected them to, but the silence that lingered felt harsher than any confrontation. I kept myself busy, though the quiet pressed in at odd moments. Folding laundry, cooking, even watering plants carried a strange heaviness. I would find myself staring at the phone, waiting for one of them to call, then scolding myself for being so desperate. I told myself they needed space, but the truth was, I feared distance could turn permanent if I didn't handle things carefully. Finally, my daughter reached out, though not with the softness I had hoped for. She sent a message asking if we could meet for coffee. The tone was clipped, but I didn't care. I agreed immediately. At the cafe, she arrived with her guard firmly in place. Her arms were crossed even as she sat down, her words precise and pointed. "I just need to understand why you thought it was okay to hide this for so long. Don't you think we had a right to know?" I nodded, feeling the sting of her directness but respecting it. "You're right. I should have told you sooner. I was afraid of this exact moment, of seeing disappointment in your eyes." She exhaled sharply, tapping her fingers against the cup. "It's not just disappointment. It feels like betrayal, Mom. We share everything with you, and you kept something this big from us." Her words settled heavy between us. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that parents sometimes keep things private, that I was allowed to have my own life. But I also knew defensiveness would only widen the gap. Instead, I admitted, I didn't handle it well, but I need you to know this wasn't about pushing you away. It was about figuring out if this part of my life was real before I brought it to you. For a moment, her posture softened, though her eyes stayed sharp. And is it real? Or is this just some phase? The question startled me because it echoed doubts I had once whispered to myself. But my voice was steady when I answered, It's real. He matters to me. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded, as though filing the information away. She didn't smile, but she didn't walk out either, and for that, I was grateful. When I told him later about our meeting, he listened carefully, then said, She's trying. Even if it doesn't look like it, that's a good sign. I wanted to believe that, but the bigger challenge was still my son. His silence stretched longer, and when I finally called, he answered with a flat tone that made my chest tighten. We need to talk, I said. About what? He replied, though we both knew. About us. About how you're feeling. There was a pause, then a sigh. I don't know what to say. I don't like it. It doesn't sit right with me. Oh, can we meet? I asked, my voice careful. He agreed reluctantly. We sat in his living room a few days later, the television muted in the background. His arms were folded, his expression unreadable. I keep thinking about Dad, he said bluntly. Even if he's gone, this feels, I don't know, wrong. Like you're replacing him. I felt the words pierce straight through me. No one could replace your father. This isn't about erasing him. It's about me finding something I didn't expect. He shook his head, staring at the floor. It's just weird. I don't know if I can look at you the same way. That confession hurt the most. For years, I had been his anchor, and now, in his eyes, I was a stranger. I leaned forward, my voice steady but low. I'm still the same person who raised you, who showed up for every game, every tough day, every phone call. That hasn't changed. What's changed is that I found someone who makes me feel like more than just a role. Can you at least try to accept that? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he rubbed his hands over his face, then muttered, I don't know if I can, Mom. Not yet. The honesty stung, but it was better than silence. At least he was speaking. At least he was wrestling with it instead of shutting me out completely. Over the following weeks, conversations remained cautious, often circling around logistics, who was bringing dessert to a family dinner, when we'd meet next while avoiding the topic that loomed over us. But cracks of progress showed. My daughter began asking small, almost reluctant questions about him. My son stopped dodging my calls, even if his tone remained guarded. When the day came that I suggested they might meet him, the air thickened with tension again. My daughter raised an eyebrow, skeptical, while my son frowned deeply. Meet him? My daughter asked. Yes, I said calmly. Not because I expect you to approve right away, but because sometimes people are easier to understand when you see them as real, not as an idea. My son muttered something about not being ready, but my daughter, to my surprise, agreed with hesitation. Maybe, she said, her tone clipped. But don't expect us to pretend everything's fine. I wouldn't ask you to, I replied. All I want is for you to see him, nothing more. That small step felt monumental. Even if the road ahead was uncertain, the possibility of them meeting him meant we were no longer stuck in silence. That night, as I sat alone in the kitchen, I realized something. The hardest part wasn't just revealing the truth. It was holding on to it while weathering the storm of their reactions. But no storm lasts forever. And maybe, just maybe, this one would lead us somewhere new. The first time I suggested they meet him, my words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. Neither of them said yes immediately, but the silence didn't stretch into outright refusal either, which was progress in its own way. Days later, my daughter called. Her tone wasn't warm, but it carried a trace of reluctant curiosity. If we're going to meet him, I want it somewhere neutral. No family dinner, no pressure. I agreed quickly, relieved that the door wasn't completely shut. We settled on a small restaurant in town, quiet enough to talk but public enough that no one would feel cornered. My son hesitated, but eventually agreed to come too, though his voice carried a weight that told me he wasn't doing it for himself but to prove something to me, maybe, or to keep his sister from carrying it alone. The night of the meeting, I sat at the restaurant 10 minutes early, my nerves buzzing in a way I hadn't felt in years. He arrived a little later, dressed neatly, his posture calm, but I could see the tension in his eyes. He leaned close and whispered, "Are you sure they're ready?" "No," I admitted, "but if we keep waiting, we'll never get there." When my children walked in, I caught the subtle differences between them. My daughter's steps were brisk, her chin slightly lifted, as though bracing herself. My son, on the other hand, moved slower, his expression carefully blank, the kind of mask he wore when he didn't want anyone to read him. Introductions were short, polite in the way people are when they're testing the temperature of the room. We sat down, menus in hand, though no one really looked at them. The air carried that brittle weight of people pretending at normal while waiting for someone else to break the silence. He was the first to speak. "I know this isn't easy," he said evenly, his eyes on both of them. "I just want to thank you for coming. I respect that this is a lot to take in." My daughter tilted her head, studying him with the same scrutiny she used at work when she didn't quite trust a client. "So how did this even start?" she asked, her tone clipped but not cruel. He explained briefly, sharing how we'd met, how conversations turned into something deeper. His answers were steady, never defensive, though I could feel how carefully he chose each word. My son remained quiet until my daughter pushed, "And what exactly do you want with our mom?" That question landed hard, even though I knew it was coming. He didn't flinch. "I want to be with her because she makes my life better. It's as simple as that. I'm not here to replace anyone, and I don't expect your approval overnight. But I'm willing to earn your trust." For a moment, the table fell into a stillness so sharp, I thought the clinking of silverware from another table might break it. My daughter looked at me, as if trying to gauge my reaction, then back at him. My son finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "We don't know you, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to." The honesty stung, though I appreciated that he voiced it instead of walking out. I reached across the table slightly, not to touch but to ground the conversation. "That's fair. No one's asking you to accept everything tonight, just to see that he's not an idea, but a person." Dinner itself was awkward, filled with starts and stops, but small cracks appeared in the tension. My daughter asked a few more questions, sharper than necessary, but at least they were questions. My son barely touched his food, but he stayed. To me, that counted. Afterward, as we stood outside the restaurant, I could feel the weight of what hadn't been said pressing heavier than the words spoken. My daughter gave me a quick hug, whispering, "I'm still not sure how I feel, but at least now I've seen him." My son muttered a quick goodbye, not looking either of us in the eye, before walking toward his car. When it was just the two of us again, he exhaled slowly. "That could have gone worse," he said with a wry half-smile. I nodded, though my chest carried both relief and dread. It could have, but it could have gone better too. The following week brought no breakthroughs, but subtle shifts began. My daughter called, not to dissect him, but to check in on me. Her tone was still careful, yet softer. My son remained distant, but at least he didn't avoid me. One afternoon, he called unexpectedly. His voice was flat, but his words carried more honesty than before. "I don't know if I can accept him, Mom, but I don't want this to come between us." Tears pricked my eyes at that admission, even if it wasn't acceptance. "That's all I need to hear right now," I told him. "We'll figure it out at our own pace." That night, as I sat alone, I realized something important. The hardest part wasn't convincing them to like him. It was showing them that loving him didn't mean I loved them any less. It was about proving that families can stretch, even when it feels uncomfortable, without breaking apart completely. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't resolved. But the first stone had been placed on a new path, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe we might actually find our way forward. The days after that dinner felt like standing on a shaky bridge you could cross, but every step creaked as if it might give way. My daughter hadn't shut down completely, though her questions still came with an edge. My son stayed quieter, which somehow felt heavier than anger. Silence leaves more room for worry than words ever do. A week later, my daughter invited me for coffee. I almost said no, worried it might be an ambush, but something told me to go. When I arrived, she was already seated, her arms folded across her chest. The first thing she said wasn't hi, it was, "So what exactly are you planning, Mom?" I sat down, my heart already racing. Planning? Yes? Is this just some casual thing? Or do you actually see a future with him? Because if it's the second one, we need to talk about what that means for our family. Her bluntness knocked the air out of me. For a moment, I wanted to dodge, soften, make it less direct. But she had given me an opening, and I knew dodging would only push her away further. I do see a future, I said carefully. Not because I'm trying to replace anything we had, but because I'm allowed to want something for myself now, too. Her eyes flickered, and I could tell she was torn. It just feels like you're rewriting everything. Dad's gone, and now you bring someone new in, and suddenly nothing feels familiar. That struck me deep, because it was the truth. Familiarity was what she was clinging to, and here I was, disrupting it. I get that, I said softly. But me moving forward doesn't erase your dad. It doesn't erase what we had as a family. It just means life didn't stop when he left. She leaned back, exhaling. I don't hate him, you know. I just don't trust him. And I don't trust how quickly this all happened. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was the closest thing to honesty she'd given me since this began. I nodded slowly. Then take your time. Don't force yourself to trust him just because I do. But don't close the door before you've seen who he really is either. Later that night, I told him about the conversation. He listened quietly, his expression steady. She's protecting you, he said after a pause. That's not a bad thing. It just means I have to prove I'm not a threat to what she values. Hearing him say that made me realize the weight he was carrying, too. It wasn't just my children testing him, it was him testing himself, seeing if he could stand firm in the storm without letting pride or defensiveness ruin everything. My son was harder. He didn't reach out, didn't ask questions, didn't even pretend curiosity. He avoided the subject whenever we spoke. That silence kept me up at night more than any argument could have. Finally, I decided to break it. I drove to his apartment one Saturday. He looked surprised to see me but let me in. His place was neat, almost too neat, as though he had been using order to keep the mess in his head under control. We sat on his couch, and I told him straight, I know you don't want to talk about him, but I need to know where you stand, not just guess at it. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally, his jaw tightened, and he muttered, I don't like it. I don't like him. I don't like the idea of you with him. It feels wrong. I didn't flinch, even though it hurt. Why does it feel wrong? His voice cracked in a way I hadn't expected. Because it feels like if you love him, then there's no space left for Dad. And if there's no space for Dad, then there's no space for us either. That confession broke something open in me. There will always be space for your dad, I said, my throat thick. And there will always be space for you. Loving him doesn't take anything away from either of you. It just adds something to my life that I've been missing. His eyes stayed on the floor, but I saw the way his shoulders shifted, like some of the tension had leaked out, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. He didn't give me a blessing, but he didn't shut me out either. And for now, that was enough. The next turning point came unexpectedly. My daughter called one evening and asked if I wanted to join her at the farmer's market. She paused, then added, You can bring him if you want. It was such a small thing, but I felt the weight of it instantly. An invitation not to approve, not to celebrate, but to allow. And that was more than I dared to hope for at this stage. At the market, the three of us walked through the rows of stalls. She kept her questions light, asking him about where he grew up, what food he liked, small things that didn't carry the sharpness of an interrogation. I watched her, noticing how her body language shifted, how her guard softened even as she tried to keep her tone neutral. When he offered to carry her bags without hesitation, I caught the tiniest flicker of surprise on her face, like she hadn't expected him to simply act without agenda. She didn't thank him right away, but later, I saw her quietly nod to herself, as if she had filed the moment away. That night, when I called to thank her for inviting him, she said, Don't read too much into it. I'm not saying I approve. I'm just saying I don't hate him. I smiled into the phone, even though she couldn't see it. That's a start. With my son, progress was slower. But one evening, he asked me if I wanted to join him for a basketball game on TV. It was our thing when he was younger, and the invitation meant more than the words themselves. I went, and though he didn't mention him once, I felt that maybe the door wasn't locked, it was just barely cracked open, waiting for time to push it wider. Every step felt uneven, sometimes forward, sometimes back, but it was movement nonetheless. And after months of resistance, even the smallest shift felt like a victory worth holding on to. What surprised me most wasn't the anger or suspicion my children carried, but the way ordinary life kept weaving itself around the tension. Bills still came in the mail. The sink still filled with dishes. Birthdays still had to be marked. It was as if life refused to pause, no matter how much we all wanted a break to sort out our feelings. That forced me to balance two tracks at once, one where I tried to live as normally as possible, and another where every conversation carried unspoken questions. One Saturday evening, I hosted a small dinner at my house. It wasn't meant to be a test, but I knew that in some ways it was. My daughter came first, carrying a salad, her expression calm but measured. My son followed later, holding a bottle of sparkling water like it was a peace offering. When he walked in and saw him sitting at the table, there was a second of hesitation, but he stayed. That in itself felt like progress. Dinner began stiffly. Conversations circled around safe topics, work updates, a funny story my daughter shared about her office, a neighbor's dog that had been causing trouble. He listened more than he spoke, answering only when asked, and never trying to dominate. I could tell he was walking on eggshells, careful not to give them any reason to feel threatened. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Halfway through the meal, the light over the dining table flickered and went out, leaving us in dimness. My son muttered, "That thing's been acting up for months, Mom. Didn't I tell you to get it fixed?" I sighed. "Yes, but I keep forgetting." Without a word, he stood, fetched a small toolkit from the hallway closet, and got to work. The sight of him balancing on a chair, unscrewing the fixture, reminded me so much of his father that my throat tightened. Then something happened I hadn't predicted. He joined him. Without asking, he held the flashlight steady, angled perfectly so my son could see what he was doing. It was such a simple act, but it carried a weight I don't think either of them recognized in the moment. They worked side by side for 10 minutes, barely speaking except for the occasional, "Hand me that," or "Try this." My daughter and I sat at the table, both quiet, both watching. When the light finally flickered back on, my son stepped down and tested the switch. It held steady. He gave a small nod, satisfied. "Nice work," he said. "Thanks," he replied, handing the flashlight back. It was brief, almost casual, but it was the first time my son had acknowledged him without a trace of hostility. My daughter noticed it too. I saw it in the way her shoulders eased, as if she'd been holding her breath. After dinner, when they both left, I stood at the sink washing dishes. He came up beside me, drying plates. "That went better than I expected," he said quietly. I smiled, a tired but genuine smile. Better than I dared to hope. The next week, the ripple from that evening showed itself. My son called me not to talk about him, not to bring up the relationship, but to ask if I wanted to go grocery shopping with him. We hadn't done that together in years. While we walked through the aisles, he tossed a pack of his favorite cereal into the cart and muttered, "You still buy this for yourself?" "Sometimes," I said. "Old habits." There was a pause, then he said, "He seemed fine the other night. Not pushy, just there." It wasn't a blessing, but it wasn't rejection either. It was observation, neutral ground. I held on to that like a rope across a river. Meanwhile, my daughter slowly began asking him more questions during the rare times we were all together. Practical questions about his job, his hobbies, how he spent his weekends. She never asked anything that touched emotion, but she no longer kept her distance. I realized she was gathering evidence, building a picture for herself instead of relying only on fear or assumptions. One Sunday afternoon, the three of us went to a local art fair. My daughter spotted a stall selling handmade pottery and stopped to look. He joined her, pointing out the differences in the glazing techniques. I watched as she tilted her head, considering his words. For the first time, they had a conversation that didn't require me as a bridge. Later that evening, she called me. Her voice was hesitant, but softer than usual. "I still don't know how I feel about all this," she admitted. "But I see that he treats you well. I can't ignore that." Her honesty felt like sunlight after weeks of cloud cover. I told her I didn't need her to rush her feelings, only to keep them open. Still, progress wasn't linear. There were days when my son barely returned my calls, when my daughter seemed distant again. I reminded myself that healing rarely moves in a straight line. It curves, it stalls, it sometimes doubles back before moving forward again. What mattered was that we were no longer standing still. One evening, as I sat with him on the porch, I said quietly, "You know they may never give us full approval, at least not in the way you might want." He nodded. "I don't need them to approve. I just need them to see that I'm not taking anything away from them." That was the heart of it. He understood, maybe better than I had at first, that this wasn't about convincing them to like him. It was about proving that their bond with me was safe, untouched. By the end of that month, something had shifted. The silences between my children and him were no longer heavy. They were simply silences, the natural kind that happen in any gathering. That difference, though small, meant everything. What stood out to me as the weeks went on wasn't just how my children were adjusting, but how much I was learning about my own strength in the middle of it all. I had always thought of myself as someone steady, someone who made decisions carefully and avoided conflict whenever possible. Yet here I was, navigating conversations layered with history, emotions, and uncertainty. That realization gave me a different kind of steadiness, one that came from experience rather than control. One evening, I invited both of my children to join me for a casual Sunday brunch. I didn't tell them until they arrived that he would be there too. I wasn't trying to trick them, but I wanted to see how they would handle the situation without the weight of anticipation pressing on them all week. When they walked in and saw him pouring orange juice into glasses, they both froze for a second. My son set his keys down slowly, my daughter's lips pressed into a thin line, but neither turned back toward the door. The meal started quietly. He asked my daughter about a new project she was leading at work. She gave clipped answers at first, but as he listened without interrupting, her responses grew longer. My son, on the other hand, kept glancing at his watch as though counting the minutes. I knew his patience was still fragile. The turning point came halfway through when my son mentioned his car making a strange noise. Without missing a beat, he leaned forward and asked about the sound. My son described it, and within minutes, the two of them were debating whether it was a belt issue or a loose part in the exhaust. It wasn't a friendly exchange, not yet, but it was real. It was two people engaging over something practical, without me needing to mediate. I sat back, sipping my coffee, and let them talk. For once, I didn't feel like a referee. I felt like a mother watching her son carve out space with someone he didn't fully trust yet, but no longer dismissed outright. Later that day, after they left, my daughter texted me. She wrote, "He's trying, Mom. I can see that. I don't know what I feel yet, but I see it." That single line was worth more than any speech. It told me she was moving beyond suspicion into observation, and from there, maybe into acceptance. But acceptance didn't come in one sweep. A few days later, we attended a family gathering at my sister's house. I knew it would be complicated. Extended family can sometimes be harsher judges than our own children. When we arrived together, I felt the shift in the room. Conversations paused. Smiles appeared quickly, but I could sense the questions behind them. My sister greeted him politely but reservedly. An uncle asked me in a lowered voice if I was serious about this. The scrutiny was familiar, but what made the moment different was how my children responded. Instead of joining in the subtle judgment, they both stayed close to me. My daughter made small talk with him, asking about the art fair we had attended. My son didn't say much, but he didn't roll his eyes or step away either. During dinner, one of my cousins made a comment, half a joke, half a jab about my new friend. Before I could reply, my daughter spoke up. Her voice was even, but firm. "He's important to Mom. That's enough." I froze for a second, stunned. That was the first time she had openly defended me in this situation. The table went quiet, and then the conversation moved on. I caught her eye across the table and gave her a look of quiet gratitude. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. After we left the gathering, I expected her to retreat again, maybe to feel she had spoken too soon. But instead, she pulled me aside in the driveway and said, "I'm not saying I'm completely okay with everything, but I don't want anyone treating you like you're making a mistake." It wasn't a declaration of full approval, but it was protection, and that was more than I had dared to expect. My son's journey was slower. He still struggled to let go of the idea that I was vulnerable, that someone new in my life meant he was being replaced. But even he began to show signs. One evening, He dropped by unannounced while I was cooking dinner with him. Instead of making an excuse to leave, he grabbed a cutting board and started chopping vegetables alongside us. He didn't talk much, but his actions spoke loudly. Afterward, when it was just the two of us, he muttered, "I don't want to like him too fast, but I don't want to lose you either." I placed my hand on his arm. "You won't lose me. You never could." It struck me then that this was the core of all their resistance, not dislike of him, but fear of losing me. Once I truly understood that, I was able to meet their hesitation with more patience and less defensiveness. By the end of that month, a small but undeniable shift had happened. We could all sit in the same room without tension crushing the air. My children still had their doubts, but they were no longer walls. They were questions waiting for answers. The most powerful moment came one evening when my son stopped by again, this time with a folder under his arm. He laid it on the kitchen counter and said, "I'm thinking about buying a place. Can I get your opinion?" It was a simple request, but it told me everything. If he trusted me enough to share a big decision, even with him in the picture, then maybe we were finding our balance after all. That night, after everyone left and the house was quiet, I sat in the living room and let myself breathe. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was holding everything together by sheer will. I felt something steadier, something like hope. When I look back at everything I went through, I realize the hardest part wasn't the words that were said to me, but the quiet moments afterward when I questioned myself. It's in those pauses that we either shrink or rise. I chose to rise. Not perfectly, not quickly, and certainly not without tears, but I chose to stand in my own dignity. If there's one thing I hope you carry with you after listening to my story, it's this: your worth is not determined by someone else's opinion. It's built, piece by piece, when you decide to take back your power, even when it feels easier to stay silent. But the journey doesn't stop here. What surprised me most was how life kept opening new doors the moment I stopped letting others define me. I found myself facing an entirely new chapter, one I never imagined stepping into. And if you're curious about how criticism from the very people closest to me pushed me into a role I never expected, you'll want to hear what happened next. It's a story that proves sometimes the very conflict meant to break us can end up shaping our greatest purpose.